Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sam Hirst, and I'm going to be talking to you today, as you can see, about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I'm an academic who works with Gothic literature, of which this is one of the most famous examples. You might already have been studying or heard of or read some other examples, such as Frankenstein by Mary Shelley or Dracula by Bram Stoker. But I work with the Gothic more broadly and also looking at the ways in which literature and theology connect together. Now, don't worry, theology might be something that you're not very familiar with, but I'll be taking you through some very simple ideas that are relevant to the book that we're reading today. Now, the basic idea that we're going to be looking at and thinking about is duality and how that is understood in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As he tells us himself, man is not truly one, but truly two. Now, you might have looked at this duality in a number of different ways. Quite a common way of looking at it is thinking about it psychologically, with Dr. Jekyll being sort of the ego or superego, the controlling part of his consciousness, and Mr. Hyde being the id, those repressed desires that come to the fore when he takes the potion. Now, that's a great way of looking at it and interrogating the text. But what I'm wanting to do is looking at the theological ideas with which Robert Louis Stevenson was deliberately engaging, that he was deliberately using and talking about in his work. As you can see, this idea of duality is really key. And there's a couple of things to draw out about how this duality works and how it's understood in the book. So Dr. Jekyll says of himself, I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. So sometimes it's easy to think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as being completely separate, being the good and the bad. But we have to remember that Dr. Jekyll is sort of a Mr. Hyde plus the good. He is both good and bad, and Mr. Hyde is the separated out representation of just all that badness. But Dr. Jekyll himself has two natures that are at war with each other, that are contending. And he's not one or the other, but he is, as he says, radically both. Now, what has this got to do with theology? Well, this idea of duality is really key to the Christian theology with which Robert Louis Stevenson was most familiar, which is Scottish Calvinism. Now, Calvin was a Protestant thinker, and his ideas are very common, and we find them in a lot of different theologies. This idea of duality as well is seen more widely in Christianity. But what is this idea of duality? What am I talking about? Well, it's this idea that we can see expressed in Romans 8:5 or in Galatians 5:17. Now, these are Bible passages that talk about the way in which we as humans are two things, flesh and spirit. For the flesh craves what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. So this flesh and this spirit are in a tug of war with each other. They're opposed to one another so that you do not do what you want. In other words, there are two sort of sides to us as human beings. But what does it mean by the flesh and the spirit? Now, there's an easy mistake to fall into here, thinking that the body, the flesh is the body, and the body is bad, and all physical things are bad. And that's not what this is saying. Instead, as we see from Calvin here, he explains what is meant by the spirit and the flesh. The spirit, he says, denotes the renewed nature or the grace of regeneration. And what else does the flesh mean but the old man? Now, you might be thinking, what's an old man got to do with things? What is this renewed nature? What is this talking about? Well, this is the idea that as humans, we were all born already condemned, already full of sin, full of badness because of the original sin of Adam, which has sort of infected every single human being in the world. So he's saying that the old self is the flesh, this part of ourselves which is infected with sin. But because of the sacrifice of Christ in Christian theology, we can be removed from that old self. We can be redeemed. We can be regenerated or made new. And that sort of part of us is the spirit. And that spirit is connected to God and it's connected to good. And in our lives, even as Christians, after we convert, there's always going to be these two things at war with each other: the good and the bad, the flesh and the spirit, the godly and the corrupt. So this is the really central idea which we're finding in Robert Louis Stevenson. And it's an idea which is really central to particularly the Scottish Gothic. Now, I don't know if you're very familiar with the Scottish Gothic, but one of its main preoccupations is with demons, and specifically demonic doubles, where we have this idea of the flesh and the spirit, the good and the bad, in the form of doubles, where there is a man, usually, and there's somebody who looks a great deal like him. But the question is this person him? Is it some sort of psychological breakdown and he's seeing a double of himself? Or is this some sort of devil, a representation of that inner badness, that inner corruption that is at war with his good self? So a couple of examples of these, if you're wanting to have a look for yourselves, from 1824, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. It's one of my favorite books and includes the story of a man who meets somebody who looks surprisingly like him. And then there seems to be a blurring of their two identities because he starts to do things that he has no memory of. Did he do them or did the stranger do them? And is this stranger real? Is it an actual person or is it a demon or is it him? Who can say? Interestingly, thinking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we have Markheim, a short story that was written the year before Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written, which also has this devilish double. We have a man going into a shop, committing a murder, and then meeting somebody who looks surprisingly like him, who has a sort of theological debate with him about whether he should confess to the crime or not. And as you can see from the last picture, this is a tradition in Scottish literature which is going right up to today. The Testament of Gideon Mac is another story about a preacher or a pastor who confronts somebody whose nature is very ambiguous, and we don't know, are they a double, a devil? Who are they? So you can see that we have this tradition, and it has sort of two main forms. The first of these forms we see really in that Confessions of a Justified Sinner, where there are two souls and one body. Although he meets the friend, Gil Martin, as an external person, later on, the question is about who is controlling his body. He says we are all subjected to two distinct natures in the same person. And you can see here he's using almost exactly the same idea as we find in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? But he says, I have two souls which take possession of my bodily frame by turns, the one being all unconscious of what the other performs. For as sure as I have at this moment a spirit within me fashioned and destined to eternal felicity, as sure am I utterly ignorant of the crimes you now lay to my charge. So he's saying that there are two souls going on and controlling his body at different times. He thinks that his soul is blessed, is saved, is destined to eternal felicity or eternal happiness. But his body is doing things that he has no memory of. It's committing crimes, murders that he has no memory of, so he says, because another soul is taking over his body. So what we have here is a sort of very literal, very extreme version of that duality of the flesh and the spirit, where they're sort of taking over his body by turns. Now, let's finish up by looking at how these ideas appear in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and whether we're right to think about these religious and theological arguments. Well, of course we are, I would say. We have here Dr. Jekyll explaining about why he decided to make this potion and who he was before he drank it. He tells us that he had an exacting nature, which means he had really high standards for himself. And he suggests that he had more differentiation in him. There was more difference between the good and bad in him than in the majority of men. So even a deeper trench than in the majority of men severed in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterately on that hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful sources of distress. So here you can see he has the idea that men have a dual nature. There is an inherent internal duality. And what does that duality mean? Where does it come from? Well, he talks about religion. He's using this religious idea, this theological idea of duality, of that fight between the flesh and the spirit. Now, something that is always worth remembering is that these two things are not, as we find in the Confessions and Memoirs of a Justified Sinner, sort of taking over his body by turns. And neither of them is more true or more real than the other. They are both part of him. He says he was so profound a double dealer, but he was in no sense a hypocrite. So he wasn't pretending to be good. He was good and bad at the same time. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame than when I labored in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow, and everything else that he did. So you can see that both of those things are seen as being true. There's not a sense that one is real and one is false. They're both there, they're both together, and they're both at war with each other. And so he tries to separate them out. Now, you'll remember from the experiment that he doesn't really care which one gets separated out, or so he says. But what it ends up doing is separating out all the bad to create a self that is entirely flesh, is entirely evil, is entirely corrupt, leaving Dr. Jekyll still being radically both. He says 2 characters appeared as well as 2 appearances, and one was wholly evil, the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound as whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. So to sum up, what we have here, Robert Louis Stevenson is engaging with this theological idea of duality. That's what Dr. Jekyll is experiencing, and that's what he wants to try and get over. He wants to use a scientific solution to cure a theological problem, to get rid of his old self, to get rid of that part of his personality. He creates a potion, but of course, it all goes wrong because the potion leads to the separation only of the evil side. He never gets to be the good man that he perhaps wanted to be, the holy good man that he perhaps wanted to be. And there's a lesson in this, a theological lesson, as well as many other lessons in the text, which is that you can't use science to solve a theological problem. Thanks for listening, and I hope that this was useful.